So welcome everyone to today's seminar, Workers with Whistles. We who are inviting to this are Eurocadres. We are a trade union organization representing 6 million professionals and managers in Europe. And we are now broadcasting live also on Facebook. A recording of this webinar will be available after the webinar, following some final editing. So Eurocadres has been active on whistleblower protection for quite a few years now. We started our work in 2013 and got really active when we created the platform whistleblowerprotection.eu, which was in 2016 when we had our first meeting. We were working together, 90 organizations in a platform to promote a directive which is to protect whistleblowers in the European Union. And we managed to do this. We got a directive in force in the end of 2019, which is 1 year ago. And as a directive only is really valid when it comes into force in the EU member states through the implementation into national legislation, which is the transposition period. The member states now have 2 years, so 1 year left out of this 2-year period to implement the directive. We've been working not only on the advocacy and campaigning part of this. We of course see that when we get now legislation in place in the EU member states, we need to boost our own work from the trade union movement side. So what we have been doing is to run a couple of projects. One of the projects is a training project that we have targeted trade unions with, and one component of this project is the creation of a toolkit. Our partner in this project has been Protect, and with us today we have Elizabeth Gardiner from Protect, who will introduce the toolkit which we are launching today. It will be available later today via our website. With us today we also have Vigjilenca Abazi, who is Vigjilenca Abazi is working together with us in another project that we are running. This is called Whistleblowing in European Companies, Industrial Relations for Successful Implementation of Reporting Channels. We know how to set nice long titles to projects. This project is a research project, and Vigjilenca, who comes from Maastricht University, will be speaking before us today on the topic of trade unions and the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. With us today we also have Arron Phillips, who is from Berkeley, I forgot the name of the university. I had to check that. From London University, and who has been conducting a PhD study on trade unions and whistleblowing, and he will be presenting some of the findings to us, which looking very much forward to, as this is going to be a bit of an exclusive for us. These are findings that have not yet been published. We were supposed also to have with us today Isabel Sjöman from the European Trade Union Confederation, Confederal Secretary. Unfortunately, she had to cancel this morning, and this due to the European Commission prolonging a meeting which she is currently in, so she has not got the possibility to join us now. We also have with us Nayla, who is from the French trade union UGICT-CGT. Nayla is also part of the Eurocadres Presidium and has been working on whistleblower protection together with us in Eurocadres for quite some time now. We also have Steenbergen from the Dutch trade union FNV, who is a whistleblowing expert as well, and he's also been the representative of the European Trade Union Confederation in the work on standardization of whistleblowing management. First of all, just a couple of words on why Eurocadres has been working on on whistleblowing? Well, for us, this is about professionals and managers, our members, often being in the position that they are the first to encounter information which must be disclosed in the public interest. There must be a way to behave ethically on your job. And if you can't do that, you need to be able to report on this, both internally, but also externally and going public as well. So for us, this is very clearly about professional ethics. It's about also corporate social responsibility. So for trade unions, this should really be an important issue. And I know that some of the findings that Arron will be talking about today really underpins this message as well. So I would like to start off today's proceedings with giving the floor to Arron to introduce his work on this. Arron, please.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to be with you and to be able to start sharing the findings from my PhD. So as Martin mentioned, I'm a lecturer at Birkbeck University, Birkbeck College, University of London. And I've spent the last 6 years working on my PhD, which has been looking at the role trade unions play in the whistleblowing process. I'm mainly focused on the UK, but I've also explored Netherlands and Norway as well to kind of identify some of the differences in the social roles that trade unions have. And in exploring this, I've looked at multiple data sources, from interviews to parliamentary data, through to whistleblowing advice line support. So I'm just going to feed some of these findings. Obviously, I've only got 15 minutes, so haven't got time to explore in a lot of detail, but I just want to pull out some of the important things that I think for trade unions at the moment going through this transposition period. So I think the first thing to note is whistleblowing is very important for trade unions to engage with. So in the advice and research that I looked at, we explored 500 cases of whistleblowers who rung an advice line for support. And of that, we removed several cases because we didn't know their trade union membership status. But of those where we did, which was 323, there, as you can see on the screen, 151 of them were trade union members. So nearly 50% of those who rang for advice from this independent advice line were trade union members. And what this table doesn't show is that the majority of those rang the advice line after having spoken to their trade union. So that suggests the trade unions aren't engaging in the way that whistleblowers would like their unions to do so. So there's a really good starting point for trade unions to recognize that a lot of whistleblowers are trade union members, and therefore it's an important thing for them to get involved with. What were a positive that I found in my research was that trade unions do encourage whistleblowing. So they speak positively about people speaking up about things going wrong in their workplaces. So that was a really positive thing to see. Also, they talked about the emotional side of blowing the whistle, the impact it has on whistleblowers and their mental health and their well-being, which was really good. Unfortunately, alongside this, very few of the trade unions that I spoke to in the data did it come out that they were engaging in dealing with the issue. And we know from previous research that the majority of whistleblowers blow the whistle because they're looking for the concern to be looked into and or rectified. So trade unions not engaging in that is potentially, adding to this emotional strain that the whistleblower faces. But on the flip side, it's good that trade unions are recognizing this emotional strain. Unfortunately, a lot of the research that I've identified and the perceptions of trade unions hasn't been as positive. So a lot of trade unions see whistleblowing as a last resort. They see it at the end of the line. Once everything else has gone wrong, then the whistleblower will speak up, and that will be the whistleblowing. None of the UK trade unions, for instance, recognize that whistleblowing began at the early stages, going to your line manager, saying, here's a concern. So there's a real lack of understanding by trade unions as to what whistleblowing really is. And a lot of trade unions see whistleblowing as an individual act. It's one person standing up and saying, I've got this concern. And for trade unions, that was a real problem because they see their purpose as collective. We're here to support our wider membership. And therefore, we don't want to get involved in that individual act of whistleblowing because it may put us into conflict with the majority of our membership. And if we've got one member who's saying, I want to raise this concern, and 50 members saying, we don't want the union to get involved, we just want them to protect our jobs and do what they're meant to be doing, trade unions are intrinsically going to side with the majority of their members. Does that stack up though? Well, if we go back to the data from the advice line, what I found was that of the 263 cases, the majority witnessed the wrongdoing alone and blew the whistle on their own. But 100 out of the 263 witnessed the wrongdoing as a group. So there was more than one of them witnessed it. And this is self-reported information to the advice line. So it's possible that even within that 163 that witnessed alone, other people in the workplace that were union members saw it, but that the whistleblower themselves were unaware of that individual blowing the whistle. So there's a strong number here where the wrongdoing is witnessed by more than just the whistleblower. And therefore, it could be argued that trade unions should see this as a collective. They can take this up as a collective issue because it's more than just one individual that's seeing the concern. Now, as this is around transposition, I thought I'd predominantly focus on kind of what I've found it in terms of engaging in lobbying for legislation. So what I did for this was I looked at the parliamentary data and lobbying of trade unions in the UK, Norway, and Netherlands to see if there were any differences in approach and the outcomes of those differences. And I did find that there was a significant difference. So the social relationship of the trade union with partner organizations such as the government, with other organizations that are advocating for whistleblowing legislation, businesses and business federations, where there is integration and partnership and legitimate partnership, then we see that the trade unions have far more influence, and things that they want in the legislation is often found within the legislation. And the Netherlands is a really good example of this. And I know Rick's here, so he may be able to comment on this, but the FNV were very strong from the beginning, back in 2002, 2003, I think it was, when they had their advice line open, which led to them lobbying for the legislation, and all the way through up to their legislation in 2016, they were a big part of that. And we see that they were engaged right through. And yes, while the legislation in the Netherlands does have some flaws, it has the support of the FNV and the wider trade union movement. Whereas if we go to the UK and look at the legislation and the lobbying, we don't see the trade unions involved, and they weren't particularly involved back in 1998 when the legislation came on board. In fact, when I was talking to the trade unions, it was the parliament that came, and the government of the day, the Labour government of the day, that went to the TUC and said, here's a piece of legislation we're minded to support through parliament. Do we have the trade union support for this piece of legislation? And only then did the TUC get involved and say, yes, we support this piece of legislation. And again, when the reforms in 2013 and the consultations by Public Concern at Work, as it formerly was, now Protect, and the government came about, again, the trade unions were very reactive to this rather than proactive. And we see that the things that the trade unions were asking for, such as protection for the trade unions when they're providing advice to their members, never made it onto the statute. So one of the findings is, it does appear that the more proactive trade unions are in the lobbying and the legislative process, the better the legislation is for trade unions. And we need the legislation, and we need trade unions to be engaged in the legislation, because if they're not, then my research suggests that trade unions don't engage. So the UK legislation, trade unions aren't mentioned, don't have a role. And back in 1998, when the legislation went through Parliament, there was a request by one of the Lords to the government, why aren't trade unions involved in this? Why aren't they specified in the legislation? And the government's response was, well, we don't need to put trade unions in the legislation because whistleblowing will be an ordinary activity in the workplace that trade unions will engage with, just like they do for grievances, disciplinaries, redundancies. So the political intention was that trade unions would be involved in whistleblowing and supporting. But that hasn't been evidenced in the last 20 years, and trade unions aren't engaging. So it's important for that. And it's essential for trade unions to engage and have a role in this process. Why? Well, trade unions are the only independent organization within the internal framework, if you like, of organizations. So yes, organizations might have works councils, joint consultation committees, but they're often the set up and defined by the organization themselves. And so the whistleblower may have little trust in them, whereas the trade union is, although inside the organization, has some power to engage with the organization, is external from that organization, and therefore has other means to apply pressure to the organization to bring around change. So if I was to suggest what trade unions can do, I think I would say trade unions need to have a better understanding of what whistleblowing is. It can't be seen as a last resort, because if trade unions leave it to that point, then the trade unions have missed the opportunity to support the whistleblower effectively and bring around the change that is needed from the concern that's being raised. So they need a better understanding of whistleblowing. Secondly, trade unions need to engage with the concern as well as the emotional welfare of the individual. We know trade union individual whistleblowers blow the whistle because they want the concern resolved and looked into. So if trade unions aren't engaging in that, they're missing out on what the true intentions of the whistleblower are, and therefore the whistleblower is going to lose trust in the trade union. Trade unions should look to collectivize these issues. As we've seen, a concern raised is usually seen by more than just the whistleblower and will impact the wider group of the union's membership. Okay, so it's a benefit to the trade union to try to collectivize these concerns that are raised. And by doing that as well, it should reduce the emotional stress whistleblowers face. Taking it collectively and dealing with the organization on a collective means that the individual themselves isn't having to put their head above the parapet, if you like, and dealing with all that emotional anxiety and worry that comes with raising a concern. And finally, trade unions should seek to engage in that wider debate and seek to attain a role within the legislation, whether that's having a fixed right to advise and support, represent, or receive disclosures is going to be dependent on the trade union strength and the country that they're within. But they need to be pushing for a role within the legislation so that they increase visibility, increase engagement. And so those are just a few key findings from my doctoral study that I thought would be useful to share this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arron. This was immensely interesting. Very happy to hear about your first findings, and looking forward to digging more into this when you get to release more of your findings in your study. So now we are moving on to our project expert from our research project, Vigjilenca Abazi, who is from Maastricht University, has been working a long time on this directive and even been part of the preparatory process. Vigjilenca was part of the team which created the draft directive that the Greens published a couple of years ago, which really helped kickstart this process, which also we from Eurocadres were part of the consulting organizations in that. So I hand over to you, Vigjilenca, to introduce your stuff.
Thank you so much. And I just want to wish everyone a good morning and thank you everyone for joining. And I think in light of Phillips' finding that, we should know, trade unions should know what whistleblowing is, I think webinars like today precisely seek to provide that knowledge and to share those insights. And of course, Eurocadres has been extremely active from day one, from preparatory stages. So without any further ado, I'll also share my screen. My focus this morning is on, again, on trade unions, but specifically within the EU Whistleblower Directive. For those of you who know the directive, obviously, you would know that the directive does not use the wording whistleblower directive, but of course, we also understand that that's what it seeks to do. So in the short time, I thought to make sure that I keep my points very concise. And so two sentences, if I can say so, that I would hope the participants of this webinar can remember after my talk is, what does the Whistleblower Directive do? Well, it does provide a wide definition on workers, who is a worker that's protected by this directive, and that's welcome. However, it is not per se a directive focused on workers, and I will explain what I mean with that, and nor does it focus on working conditions of workers. And I think I will explain why that's problematic, and we'll hear more about that also later on in this webinar. And the second point to remember, and this goes very much in line to what already was mentioned by the previous speaker, which is that trade unions can have an enhanced role in the implementation stage, which is now ongoing. They definitely should seek to have a role as a reporting channel, and certainly will play an important role in enforcing this directive and helping the whistleblowers in enforcement and maintaining those rights. So basically, these are the two main gists of what we should remember of what the EU Whistleblower Directive seeks to provide. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into what does that really mean. So starting with, who are the workers with the whistles, as also the title of this webinar is, it's important to point out that the directive in this regard is quite wide, that it covers individuals, workers, both in the private and in the public sector. And that was very welcome because for those of us who followed, of course, the legislative process, that was not a self-evident or obvious route for the directive to take. So this is an important thing to emphasize. Another important aspect is that the notion of worker is an open notion, that the directive, as I have indicated in my third point here, does refer to civil servants, the self-employed, managements, shareholders, individuals who are volunteers, trainees, whether paid or unpaid, contractors, subcontractors, and including individuals who disclose breaches that occur or that they learn during recruitment process, even if they're not essentially hired through that process, therefore not even formally gaining the label of a worker, and of course former workers. In this regard, this is one of the angles, or this is one of the very much welcomed aspects of the directive, because it does provide either on par or even goes beyond a global best practices in terms of really trying to seek to be comprehensive. So this is the good news about the directive. Now, the not so great news about it, in a way, is that the directive, as I said, is not per se focused on workers. And by that, I mean that including in its name, the directive focuses on breaches, on reporting of breaches of union law, And that has certain implications. The framework that you're seeing in front of you right now tries to show you, and this is from the Commission itself, sort of what is the role of whistleblowing, which is supposed to be an additional channel of information in order to make sure that union rules are being enforced, are being respected. And I emphasize here EU law because the directive does not cover national law, strictly national law. Of course, that in today's world with European Union, what is strictly national law is very much in a way integrated with European law, so they're not always very clear ends. But nevertheless, this is an important aspect to mention. Now, the reason why I say the emphasis on law enforcement and not per se workers is where we see this also when we talk about the scope. Okay, so the question then is, who does it protect? Okay, the workers, and we have a wide definition, but then in what should workers be reporting about? And that's where we see certain limitations. So although the directive expands to 12 policy fields, including reporting on everything from data protections to travel to environment to a variety of issues, it does exclude working conditions. Which is an important aspect to, of course, workers' well-being. And that is, in a way, a minus that we see with the directive. The notion of what a breach can be, that's also quite broad. And information on breaches, what's important to emphasize is that including reasonable suspicion about an actual or a potential breach. So in this regard, the directive tries to have not only a role of ex post facto, or after the wrongdoing possibly has occurred, but tries to also have a preventive role. And in this regard, it provides workers with a broader field of what they can report on. But as I said, working conditions are not included because labor law in the European Union law generally remains largely still a national competence. And without trying to bore you with too many legal details early in the morning, I just wanted to point out that the directive includes a lot of treaty provisions as legal basis, but does not refer to Article 153, which specifically focuses on workers. Nevertheless, the directive does impose an obligation to the Commission to consider whether the scope of the directive should be expanded to include working conditions by the time the directive is reviewed by 2023, and of course, possibly suggest amendments which are supposed to take place the latest by 2025. Now, to make this more legal abstraction a bit more concrete, why do we care about the working conditions? Why does this matter? I wanted to share a very topical, in a way, example with you, which is a doctor in Poland being fired for having shared in her own social media account earlier this year that the working conditions in the hospital that she was working were not satisfactory. And in this regard, the dilemma arises whether this reporting, so as we know, currently the directive is still not enforced, but the question arises, had it been enforced, would this doctor be protected? Would this be considered as an instance of whistleblowing, or rather, would this not be the case? Because the reason why we ask that question is because on the one hand, we're obviously dealing with public health. We're talking about a pandemic, and public health is included in the directive, but at the same time, what the doctor is specifically referring to is the lack of masks and the lack of equipment, which prevent her from obviously properly doing her job or actually endanger herself and her own health and well-being. So these are situations that we would see in practice, not only in public health, but surely in also other fields as well, where the fact that we have these margins makes it less certain for workers. And this is something actually that trade unions can very much have a say on, and definitely have this proactive approach now during the implementation. So let me move then to the second sentence that I said, that trade unions can have a role in the implementation stage now as a reporting channel and in enforcing the directive. Starting with the aspect of what reporting tiers. So when we talk about tiers, we understand that it's important to emphasize that the directive provides 3 different layers, so to say, of reporting: internal, by which we mean within the employer; external, by which we mean all other different bodies that are outside one's organization; and a public, which are a variety of means that public reporting can take place. Now, I want to draw your attention to 2 particular paragraphs, which are actually in the preamble of the directive, because it's interesting to see that trade unions are mentioned both when it comes to protection against retaliation, when information is provided within an organization or to an outside authority, or for information that's available in the public domain. And as you can see here, as I've highlighted, that it particularly refers to trade unions. This means indeed that trade unions now, during the implementation stages, can be much more voiceful towards national legislators to make sure that these preambles actually are manifested in legally more binding obligations for the national legislator, and that actually that the role of trade unions are more specifically elaborated, explicated at the national legislation. In addition, in paragraph 54, we see that third parties, when they're authorized to receive reports of breaches on behalf of legal entities, or when they provide guarantees for as a reporting platform, trade unions here once again are mentioned. So very much the directive is providing an avenue, it's providing an opening for trade unions to sort of grab, if I can say so, and really make sure that at the national level, these are much more clearly provided, rather than at this stage, of course, only noted as the preamble. So as far as reporting is concerned, the directive is clearly, I guess I'm emphasizing one more time, providing an opening for which the trade unions can have this more proactive approach now during the implementation stages, for them actually to make sure they have an active role during the reporting. Now, looking a bit more deeper in the directive itself, so going beyond the preamble and actually looking at the legal provision itself, here too, we see that the directive is providing an aspect where trade unions can sort of use as a legal grounding to have a more proactive role. Particularly, we can note Article 8, paragraph 1, which notes about refers to following consultation with social partners, which trade unions certainly can be considered to be one. And that is when we talk about obligations to establish internal reporting channels. So here, one could argue that the trade unions can very much ensure that they are part either of this internal reporting system, or potentially even being a guiding force for providing support for whistleblowers for retaliation, also through the reporting procedure. So therefore, we also need to look at Article 9 that provides for the procedure for internal reporting and the necessary follow-ups. In the follow-ups that should be provided to the whistleblower upon their disclosure, trade unions here too can have a role that ensure that, for example, very much in line to what, for example, Phillips' finding already show, to enhance the voice of the whistleblower, to empower the voice of the whistleblower, and not allow that that's only a single voice versus a big organization, but actually that it can be sort of a collective check versus the employer in terms of whether the employer is following up with a reported breach or possible suspicion of the whistleblower. All right, so without abusing much of my time, I just want to also point to 2 other important aspects, and that is the relationship of this directive with, in terms of what it means for trade unions with other existing laws, both at the level of the EU and nationally. Here, I would like to draw your attention to the wording that the directive uses, because it has been very much intentionally chosen, especially when we look at Article 3, which notes that the directive shall not affect national rules. That in itself means that to the extent that the directive is not in contradiction, is not in opposition with national rules, the directive shall apply. So there, again, it can have, the trade unions can use that for their role. So it does not create a limitation. It only tries to say that it shall not affect to the extent that those rules exist. But of course, to the extent that they don't, or to the extent that there is a gap nationally, trade unions can have a much more, can use that to sort of have new rules through the directive and therefore create new rights, more workers' rights at the national level. So I'll leave it at this for now, and I'm very much looking forward to discussion and questions, and of course to our panel where we can delve a bit deeper for all these matters. And thank you, Martin, once again.
Thank you, Vigjilenca. Yeah, this is interesting stuff. We have now with the two projects that we're running, one together with Vigjilenca and the other one together with Protect. We can really see some synergies of this as well. As has been mentioned both by Arron and Vigjilenca now about the role of trade unions, one of our key interest in this is to increase the capacity of trade unions. So to boost the knowledge of trade unions and to also create a stronger commitment among trade unions in this transposition progress. And here our project with Protect very much comes in, where we have been trying to train trade unions on whistleblowing and how to participate in the whistleblowing process, to empower trade unions to be more active in the workplace. And today we're launching the toolkit which Protect has developed together with us. And to present this for us is Elizabeth Gardiner, who is the director of Protect. I give the word over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you for inviting us to join today. For those of you who don't know Protect very well, we are the UK's whistleblowing charity. And I'll just share my slides with you. So we have been around since 1993, and some of you may know us by our former name, which was Public Concern at Work. And over our 27 years of work, we've advised over 45,000 whistleblowers, and we've worked with hundreds of employers to help them improve their best practice whistleblowing arrangements. And we also have a research and policy function, and some of our early work included helping to draft the bill that eventually became the UK's Public Interest Disclosure Act in 1998, which was one of the first whistleblowing laws in Europe. And the structure of that bill has stood the test of time and very much is reflected in the approach taken by the EU Directive, although we must pay credit and tribute to those, including Eurocadres, who have changed and improved the text along the way. However, our law in the UK has not kept pace with the modern workplace. Too few types of workers are protected, and too few employers are required to put any whistleblowing internal arrangements into place. So, of course, it's a great disappointment to me that the UK will not be required to implement the changes in these areas and those other improvements that the EU Directive will require. And having once led the way in whistleblowing, without further legal reform, there is a danger that we will be falling behind our European neighbours. So at Protect, we are campaigning to improve the UK's laws too, including how we should improve the role of and protections for trade unions in the process. So as Martin said, I've been asked today to talk about the whistleblowing toolkit, the best practice guide for trade unions that we're launching today. And this is the product of 18 months of work with Eurocadres, kindly supported by the European Commission. And I'd like to just pay tribute to the team at Eurocadres, to Savitsa, Janina and Fabienne, and also to Ida Nauers of the Whistleblowing International Network, who partnered with us to provide the training. So the aims of the project, let me just pull them up, were to very much identify the challenges that were faced by trade unionists, to help raise awareness of whistleblowing rights in the lead up to the implementation of the directive, and to exchange good practice. And we did this by holding training sessions with trade union reps across Europe for over the last year and a half. So Granada, Dublin and Paris, and only last week we completed our last training, having to deliver it online because we were unable to complete the webinar, the face-to-face approach. And the project was very much based on peer-to-peer learning, talking through what trade unions representatives' own views were about whistleblowing and using their ideas to help develop some tools to answer the challenges that they faced. And like previous speakers have said, our starting point is that trade unions can play a vital role in protecting and promoting the common good and the public interest in the workplace. And of course, it's the public interest that is at the heart of whistleblowing. But we know from Protect's free legal advice line that whistleblowing can be a very lonely and isolating experience. And too often the benefits of raising a concern on a collective basis can be overlooked. And unfortunately, whistleblowers are not always best served by their trade union. As Arron said, often the trade union representative will be the very first point of contact. But sometimes the representative isn't aware of whistleblowing rights. Sometimes the whistleblower's concern is misdirected into a grievance because that's how trade unions usually approach an individual, helping an individual support a conflict with their employer and missing the wider impact of that public interest concern. And sometimes even the trade union may see the individual whistleblower as damaging to the collective rather than as a responsible employee who's trying to speak up to stop harm. And yet the ability, as Arron pointed out, of trade unions to remove the risk and the burden of whistleblowing from the individual could be profound. And the outcome would be better both for the individual and for the addressing of that concern. So what did we learn about the challenges facing trade unions? Well, first, it was clear from meeting with delegates from across Europe at the webinars that we're starting from many different perspectives, depending on our cultural and societal backgrounds. So there were trade unionists who saw whistleblowing as first and foremost about freedom of expression and the right to know. But there were some who had to overcome entrenched views about whistleblowers as informants in their society. Some had a starting point of employee rights and health and well-being and protecting of those employee rights. But others were very cynical about their organization's ability to respond to trade union demands. And they told us that trade unions were far too often shut out of collective discussions at the policy level. Many saw whistleblowing as playing a really important role in good governance and holding organizations to account. But other trade union reps told us that only if whistleblowing could be shown to bring financial benefits would their employers listen to them. And they questioned whether trade unions in those circumstances were the best messenger to bring about reform. And we also talked through those internal conflicts about what happens when the trade union is asked to represent and support both the whistleblower and the person accused of wrongdoing. And what if the trade union is a manager receiving a concern? So delegates told us what they wanted to see in the toolkit. They wanted clarity about the role of trade unions. How could they juggle the competing aims of supporting the whistleblower and the accused? They wanted some very clear support for managers. How do you correctly handle a concern when it's raised with you? What questions should you ask? What assurances should you give? And how should trade unions play a role in communicating the benefits of good internal arrangements to their employers? How can they hold their employers' policies and processes to account and still be able to challenge those employers who are guilty of victimizing whistleblowers? And they wanted to see best practice. What does good practice actually look like? And we've tried to answer those questions in our toolkit. So on the role that trade unions can play, we've included case studies and some guidance on those tricky issues about and how to recognize potential conflicts for those who are in managerial responsibility positions. We've also set out some top tips and some flowcharts for managers to help them guide them through the process when they are responding to a whistleblower. And in terms of communicating the benefits of whistleblowing, we've included some of the evidence on the business benefits and some tools such as a model policy that trade unions can use to show how they are trying to help their employer reach the best outcomes. And finally, I would say that delegates also very much spoke of the need to model best practice within unions themselves. And the toolkit can help here too, to ensure that unions' own internal channels of communication are effective for whistleblowers who spot wrongdoing within the unions. And what's very clear from our project is that many trade unions across Europe are at the start of a journey. Those who took part in our training have taken the first step, shown that they want to improve their understanding and awareness of whistleblowing. But now they have the challenge of taking forward that learning to the implementation stage, both at the national level and in terms of putting policies and processes in place with their employer. But of course, putting policies in place is only the start of the journey, because our years of working with employers and with whistleblowers has shown us that whistleblowing can't just be a tick box exercise. And you can't measure the success of your whistleblowing policies just by having a policy, whistleblowing arrangements, just by having a policy in place and counting the number of concerns that you raised. So at Protect, we've developed a benchmark which allows organisations to test whether those whistleblowing arrangements are effective. Do workers feel able to speak up? Do they know how to? And can they trust that their employers will support them when they do? Because if whistleblowing is to be at the heart of an organisation's culture, trade unions are going to have to play a continuing role at holding employers to account and making sure those arrangements actually work. Now, as Martin set out in his foreword to our toolkit and the best practice guide, trade unions have both an opportunity here and a responsibility to help workers speak up. And I hope that this toolkit will help trade unions take up those opportunities in developing effective channels with their employers and fulfill their responsibilities of better supporting those who are trying to speak up to stop harm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz, for this introduction to the toolkit. Looking very much forward to working on it together with trade unions. We have an upcoming training also in the form of a MOOC. So we'll be launching more online presence to empower trade unions to deal with this very important issue. So now we are heading into our second part of today's webinar, and this is a panel discussion. We will have two new people joining us, and that is Nayla and Rick, which I mentioned before. Unfortunately, also as I mentioned, we will not be having Isabel Sherman from the European Trade Union Confederation speaking for us today, as she unfortunately had to stay in a meeting with the Commission, which has been prolonged today. But I would like to hand over the word to Vigjilenca again to moderate this this panel discussion among us.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that excellent presentation, and looking forward today to see the toolkit. Actually very curious to read more in detail about the findings that you shared with us. All right, so I'm very, very pleased that we have such an excellent panel of experts, of individuals who worked in this field and share your knowledge. So again, I'll just repeat for if anyone joined us now, our panel will be discussing the role of trade unions and the role that they have and should have and can have in the implementation and later on for whistleblowing. And today's panelists will be Nayla, Rick, Arron, and Martin. And of course, we open the discussion and we look forward to your questions. This is the purpose of this, is to be interactive and to sort of serve the knowledge of what's necessary in terms of advancing the knowledge on trade unions and the capacity of trade unions. All right, so without any further ado, I will start my first questions to Nayla. Can you share with us, please, why is it important that trade unions are involved in whistleblowing, and what can or should trade unions do in this regard? Perhaps you could share more from your perspective and from your experience as well.
Thank you, Vigjilenca. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for letting me introduce this part today. It's really a very important issue for my trade union, and we've been working on this subject since many, many years. And what I can say is that what the whistleblowers have in common is they simply wanted to do their job without jeopardizing the interests of a society. And their refusal to cover up wrongdoings has led to years of reprisals and legal proceedings. So this is not normal. This is why we are committed to work beside them to make actually their battle a collective one. So in France, we helped to set up a coalition of NGOs and trade unions, which not only ensured them a legal victory, but above all, won them collective rights. And in initial French legislation in 2016, Sapin II, and then of course the European legislation in 2019. So with 16 other organizations, we created the Whistleblowers House, Maison des lanceurs d'alerte, where we work together on the protection of whistleblowers by providing daily support and advocating for improved protection. And based on this work that we do, we wish to place these new rights in a collective framework to better protect individuals and thus regain control of the meaning and the content of our work, as simply as that.
Thank you so much for that concise answer. Well, actually, since you mentioned, of course, the House of Whistleblowers, that immediately brings us also and alludes to the experience in the Netherlands, since it's also a country that sort of has the House of Whistleblowers, but which obviously has its own kind of advantages and disadvantages, as we've learned from experience. I would like to pass on here the same questions to you, Rick. So moving on to the Dutch experience, could you share with us, from your perspective, why the role of trade unions is important and what you're doing in this regard?
Yes, thank you, Vigjilenca. In the year 2000, to answer Arron, it was the correct year, we had an inquiry on workers, not only members, about what were their experiences with reporting wrongdoing. And we hoped we would get some reactions, because we knew how dangerous it is for whistleblowers to make known they blew the whistle. So it was outside the office hours, and much to our surprise, the reactions were overwhelming. It led to items on television, radio, newspapers, and in fact it put the item of whistleblowing on the national and political agenda. So since 2000, in fact, we had to play our role as a trade union, as an initiator of all kinds of protection of whistleblowers. And in the decennia, we have been occupying with this item. Our involvement has grown, as a matter of fact. We give advice and support, also legal support, on an individual basis. We seek publicity if necessary, also for individual whistleblowers. We take over the reporting of wrongdoing as a trade union, because retaliation is dangerous for workers, but trade unions are stronger in the towards the employers. We inform workers about their rights related to whistleblowing in brochures. We investigate the perception of integrity under workers. At this moment, there is an inquiry under civil servants in the Netherlands working for municipalities. We ask these civil servants what are their experiences of wrongdoing in municipalities. How often do they see wrongdoing, and what are they doing with this knowledge, and what are the effects of reporting wrongdoing within these municipalities. We provide workers' representatives with models for reporting wrongdoing. We lobby for and negotiate on standards for whistleblowing, legislation, statements, codes of conduct, guidelines on all relevant levels. And we enter into strategic alliances with relevant stakeholders, employers, organizations, environmental organizations, Transparency International, and so on. We join forces with authorities to take the necessary steps towards the wrongdoing, and we exchange information with NGOs.
That's a very full agenda of activities. Thank you, Rick, so much for sharing. It's definitely a plate full of a variety of things, which in a way it goes very much in line, Arron, to bring you in here in terms of your more theoretical findings of, as you were talking and comparing countries, you mentioned that indeed you've also found that the Netherlands has a bit of a more of a proactive approach, and that has proven to be beneficial in terms of the position of whistleblowers and trade unions in particular in protecting whistleblowers. Now, you focused, Arron, during your presentation on sort of what the trade unions can do or should do. Can you maybe also tell us what they shouldn't be doing, or some of the things that they do that are not as in line, and that maybe we can focus in line of Martin's also call for capacity building? How do we build capacity and sort of reduce some of the negatives, the sides of what you witnessed through your research?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of flipping what I said they should be doing around, if you like. So, you know, obviously I highlighted that trade unions do recognize the emotional strain that's going on to individuals that are blowing the whistle. But trade unions need to recognize that, you know, whistleblowers don't want to be going through that emotionally stressful position, and don't want to be in the position where they may or may not face significant retaliation and victimization. You know, what they want is they want the concern to be addressed. You know, they want the organization to look into it, to say, you know, thank you for bringing that to us. We've looked at it. It's not a concern because of A, B, or C, or it is a concern and we're doing this. And that's really where the trade unions could have a significant impact in supporting that individual to raise the concern. And they can do that through the individual voice mechanisms, or as I highlighted, through the collective. And I think, you know, the collective is going to be a much stronger dimension for trade unions, because, you know, they're representing a larger group, if you like, because the membership within the organization will be more. So if they're coming at the organization saying, look, we're representing our membership here, and this is a concern that we've got, you know, they're removing the individual voice, putting in a much more collective. And that really forces, or should force, the organization to listen, you know, and either do something, risk the damage that a trade union can cause by taking something public. You know, as I mentioned, one of the benefits of the trade union is they are independent of the organization. You know, so if they get information and the organization ignore them, they can go outside, they can go to, you know, regulators, they can go to the media and blow the story up, if you like, to something much bigger, which then has massive reputational damage for the organization. And then the organization will have to say, well, why didn't we look at this in the first place when the trade union came to us in the, you know, 6 months, a year ago with this individual concern, which we could have dealt with back then much more simply. So yeah, I think those two key things are the things that they should avoid doing, focusing on the emotional and focusing on the individual.
Absolutely. And I think actually they go hand in hand with this idea of collective rights that you're referring to, because if there is a trade union that's strong and it's actually taking it on to kind of put forward the reporting or do the follow-up or insist, then it seems to me that it also reduces the chance that the single individual is sort of this black sheep that it's singled out and individualized, and then you don't individualize the sort of the repercussions of having blown the whistle, because you make it much more about the entirety of the collective rather than singling out individuals, which is typically what we see in practice taking place with whistleblowers. Martin, in this regard, I mean, anyone following whistleblowing in the European context obviously knows that Eurocadres has been sort of front and center in so many different initiatives, of course, partnering also with different organizations, including with Protect and others, in order to make sure that the legislation throughout the preparatory stages, including with the petition, making sure that the concern of workers are heard. So this, you sort of really much embody this proactive role that we've been discussing as far as sort of the legislative process is concerned. But could you share with us more, a little bit practically speaking, both within the framework of the directive, what the directive currently provides? Maybe you can provide a more of a sort of a practitioner's view, and then also where we can go further at the national level. Where would you suggest there are sort of important aspects that trade unions can push even further for what we have now?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the roles foreseen in the directive is the role of facilitators, and there is also a protection offered in the directive. But this protection is only for physical persons, not for legal persons in this sense. There are some gaps in the directive that we have been pointing out already, also before the directive finally was adopted, and one of them that we are really trying to push on the national level now, coming into the transposition, is to ensure that trade union members can also go to their trade union proactively and seek advice prior to blowing the whistle. And so to that this also would grant protection. I know, for example, in the proposed Swedish legislation now, this has been incorporated into it, although they have managed to screw things up a little bit because they are only granting the protection following the reporting. So I'm not really sure exactly how this is going to be working out. But of course, consulting in advance with trade unions, but the second part is also to be represented by trade union in the process. Hopefully, of course, we will be able to, with the help of the directive and the national legislation put in place following this, we'll be able to get this culture change which really is needed now in European workplaces, so that whistleblowing will be a natural thing. It will be just reporting. I mean, most cases, hopefully we don't see the problems because, yeah, I mean, things are dealt with that are reported, and the problems are solved, which are highlighted through the reporting. But when there are problems following the reporting, of course, there needs to be protection, and then the trade union must be able to step in and represent the whistleblower in this process. So these are two very practical things that we think needs to be really in writing in the national legislation that are not very clear from the directive side of view.
I recall, to follow up here, that one of the previous guidances, Martin, that you've issued, you also talk about sort of the horizontal approach. I was wondering if maybe you would want to sort of share with us a little bit more about that angle to the directive and national implementation as well.
Yeah. First of all, yes, the horizontal approach is indeed what would be solving a lot of the problems that we have. As the directive, as you mentioned in your presentation, it is based on this long list of directives and regulations and all these different legal bases from the treaties. This means that only those areas which are listed in the directive and the annexes, that's actually only what you can blow the whistle on securely. There are some provisions in there where you can, if you say that I believe that I'm covered by the directive because I think it's in there, then you should be protected. But this is a bit of a legal innovation, so we'll see how this is working also in practice when it's transposed in the member states. But yeah, a horizontal application, that would solve it. And it would also help, of course, with this whole business of not having national legislation in there. What needs to be, the most key part for the whistleblower is that it is secure in a sense that it's easy to understand that I will be covered. I shouldn't have to think, is this an illegal act or not that I'm blowing the whistle on? Is this actually covered by the legislation? I mean, any obstacle, any additional test that we put on the whistleblower just reduces the chance of the whistleblower coming forward with the information. And we want that information because the information is there to take away the wrongdoing, to fix the problem.
I've actually written about this because, including myself as a EU law professor, neither can my colleagues claim to exactly know where the EU law begins and ends, because it's always a mix. It's a bit of a mixed pot of bits and pieces now. And as I said also in my presentation, you'll find it in most national legislations in one way or another are impacted by the EU law. But what if you have a counter argument saying, no, this is strictly a national policy, therefore it shouldn't be there? And just to clarify, maybe for the non-legal experts who are maybe on our live stream or listening to the recording later, we mean with a horizontal approach that every law by default is included and that it's not focused on specific field per se, as Martin explained, which currently now includes a certain set of directives and regulations, 12 fields.
Yeah, and one aspect there, if I can come in briefly also, is of course what I highlighted in my introduction as well, that we are now missing out on occupational health and safety, on anti-discrimination, on working conditions. Those things we didn't get in the directive because of this different technique chosen. So we really need to get this in place in the national transposition. But if we don't, then it is in the directive that there will be a review 4 years after it's been in force, so 6 years from the adoption. Then the Commission will specifically also look at the issue of working conditions. So we have a second chance if we don't get it done now in the member states. So we need to also push from trade unions for this to happen at a later stage if we don't get it now.
Yes, indeed, as I mentioned, 2023 and 2025 are the two important kind of markers of dates which in a way also can focus the energy. But since we're talking so much about national implementation and emphasizing national implementation, this brings me back, Nayla, to you in terms of, could you share with us what is taking place in France right now, where we are, and sort of your activities in this regard and sort of pushing these margins forward?
Yeah, definitely. Well, actually, as I said, that we already have a law in France, Law Sapin 2, that covers many interesting items for whistleblower protection. And one of them is the working conditions that is already, we already have it in our law. But then this law is not enough. We did a survey last year, and the survey shows that it's really not enough, because I can give you just some figures about it. Is that, for instance, 36% of professionals and managers have already witnessed practices at work which are contrary to the public interest or even illegal, and 42% of people who have witnessed this type of threat did not report it. So it means that our law is not enough at all. And one of the main problem of it is the reporting channel. So the problem that we have is that we need to report first to our employer before being able to go to competent authorities or media. So this is one thing that is good with this directive, is that we will not have 3 steps reporting channel the way we have it here in France, but only 2. One good thing is that the facilitator is something new in the law, and it doesn't exist in ours. So this is something new, and we want to go further the directive and ask that to strengthen the role of the facilitator with having a systematic protection and being able to be a trade union. One also problem is the one good thing about the directive is the broader definition of protected persons. what you presented, I think, Vigjilenca, in the beginning, including pre and post contractual and unpaid professional relationships, shareholders, and self-employed persons, like, for instance, suppliers and consultants. This is something good because the definition that we have is not as wide as this one. One good thing also is the prohibition of reprisals and effective protection against criminal and civil legal proceeding against the whistleblower who is in good faith. The confidentiality of the identity of the whistleblower and the protection of the anonymous whistleblower in case of discovery. This is also something very, very important. Then one thing also that the directive gives is the reversal of the burden of proof for effective legal remedies and means of redress, damages, interim measures. And then there's also the financial sanctions against those who try to prevent the warning, and effective follow-up with a reasonable period of time. This is something that we didn't have in our law, so there is no usually 3 months. This is what is mentioned in this directive, with return of alerts to the whistleblower. And then one more thing is legal and psychological support measures for whistleblowers. So yeah, these are very good things that we want to include in our existing law, and also we want to enlarge it more and more to have, if it's possible, to have legal entities as whistleblowers and facilitators, so we can include trade unions, and why not NGOs. And finally, we would like to extend also the possibility to negotiate with the employer to set up the internal warning channels and organize annually an information and consultation on the results and the follow-up of the system. That's it.
The typical unmuted, the favorite word of 2020. Apologies. No matter how many webinars, we still keep doing the same mistakes. So thank you, Nayla, so much for that extensive answer. And just before I pass on the floor to Rick to inform us also and give us an update on the Netherlands, I want to take a question that was posed from Elizabeth Barreiros from Portugal. She asks, there's increasingly codes of ethics which impose professional secrecy, and the question is whether these codes comply with the new directive, and then how trade unions, how can trade unions use this in this regard. So as the lawyer in this panel, I'll just take the liberty to answer directly the first part of the question, that the directive actually specifically the good news about the directive is that it specifically provides that no contractual or prior legal obligation of any sorts, so not trade secrets, not professional secrecy, non-gag orders or non-disclosure agreements, cannot supersede the protection of the whistleblower. So they basically, all these instruments, all these legal regimes that generally like professional secrecy, which are generally used to silence workers, are not applicable. So let's say you are a worker and you're entering in a contract with a big tech company, let's say, and they're having a non-disclosure agreement that will not be binding to you as a worker. You will still be able to blow the whistle, or you blow the whistle and it includes trade secrets, you will still be protected because the public interest, the directive supersedes the prior directive on trade secrets. But I would like to just quickly pass on the floor very quickly to Martin on this angle of the trade unions. Is there something trade unions need to worry or engage in this regard in any way, Martin?
Well, professional ethics is what I said. This is one of the motivations why we are working on whistleblowing at all. It is to ensure that our professional ethics, being professionals and managers, can be aligned also with the work we carry out. I mean, the directive really is great in this sense that it voids the non-disclosure agreements and all these other aspects. I think here is a very important task for trade unions in advising members in especially when entering agreements, when they're picking up a new job, many trade union members consult with their unions before signing contracts, etc. So to educate trade union advisors on this really important aspect of the directive is key. This really is a new protection which is going to change quite a lot. So very happy about this aspect.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin. All right, so then I'll just, I would love to hear more, and I'm sure our panel participants would like to hear more also in terms of the implementation phase and the updates, Rick, from the Netherlands and sort of the activities that are taking place now. Where do we stand?
Yeah, thank you. There is in the Netherlands already a draft for the transposition of the European Directive and national legislation. I wrote a draft response for the social partners in the public and private sector, and I'm very glad that this draft was accepted by social partners in both the public and the private sector. And there are some shortcomings in the draft, in our opinion. One of the rather well, let me first say what one of the choices is of the Dutch government. The basic attitude from the government of the Netherlands to European directives is that only hard obligations will be transposed and no more than is strictly necessary. So, what you have, the measures you have to take because of the directive are being transposed, and all provisions that say you may do this and that extra are neglected. And in the Netherlands, we had also already legislation, as in France, we have a House for Whistleblowers Act, and to our surprise and annoyance, I must say, our government decided to make separate rules and reporting channels for breaches on union law on the other hand, and for other wrongdoing on the one hand and on the other hand. So there's depending on what is the kind of wrongdoing, you have different reporting channels and different rules for reporting. For instance, the term within you must give feedback as an employer when it's about breaches on union law are not applicable for reporting on other kinds of wrongdoing. And what is also a problem is that breaches on union law are at the same time breaches of Dutch legislation and are breaches of the public interest. So a lot of wrongdoing is both within the material scope of the provisions in the draft related to breaches on union law and the already existing breaches on other wrongdoing. So it's very much confusing both for whistleblowers and for employers. For every wrongdoing, they have to decide what rules and what reporting channels internally and externally are applicable. So this is a very big shortcoming in the draft. Further protection of relatives of the reporting persons are limited to relatives in a work-related context. So the relatives who have to be protected must also be in work-related context to the employer of the whistleblower. And there are no penalties for employers as meant in Article 23 for disclosing the identity of the whistleblower or retaliating the whistleblower. On the other hand, there are penalties for whistleblowers who report wrongdoing but don't have reasonable grounds, and there are penalties for information already existing in the in Dutch legislation. So whistleblowers can be punished, but employers cannot be punished. And there's no transposition of Article 24, which is about the waiver of rights. It's about, for instance, non-disclosure agreements. So these are very big shortcomings. And I want to also say something about the reversal of the burden of proof. This will be applied in Dutch legislation for all kinds of wrongdoing, but putting this in legislation is one thing, but complying is another thing. We had a strange case very recently in the Netherlands, and we wrote a letter as FNV about it to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Interior Affairs. There was a whistleblower on the Dutch embassy in Nigeria who reported about the ambassador who informed Shell that there was an investigation up hand. So they could, as Shell, take the necessary measures to be sure that nothing would be found in this investigation. And the whistleblower was fired because he reported this. She went to the court, and the court already applied the rule of reversal of the burden of proof and said that there was no that the dismissal was after the reporting, and that the whistleblower said there was a relation between the two, and the court concluded that the Dutch government couldn't make clear that there was no relationship between the two. So the court concluded that the whistleblower had been fired because she blew the whistle. And there were questions from members of parliament to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then the reaction of the Minister of Foreign Affairs was, we don't agree with the conclusion of the court. It was our fault that we couldn't convince the court. But nevertheless, in our opinion, there is no relationship between the reporting of the wrongdoing and the dismissal. So there are no consequences at all. And in our letter to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, SFNV, and to the Minister of Internal Affairs, we stressed that, of course, the verdicts of the court have to be respected, and it wouldn't be an protection for whistleblowers if you just could say, oh yeah, it's our fault that we couldn't convince the courts, but it doesn't change anything about the relationship between the reporting and the sanctions. So these are two things.
it sounds a bit, that sounds a bit not very much in principle with the Dutch sort of general idea of, rule of law and respectful of courts and adjudication. But it is very positive in that sense that the court has done this even before the directive is enforced. And maybe what's promising looking ahead is, of course, while the ministries might be defensive and sort of save face by saying, no, this is not what we're doing, we didn't do something wrong. It's very positive, nevertheless, that from a judicial perspective, that's already the standard that's being applied. And that should hopefully be comforting to future whistleblowers, that the court will continue to follow that precedent and that approach. I want to bring here, I know we have Brexit, but the UK still there, and still a lot of experience, since obviously one of the oldest laws actually on this side of the pond, if we don't take into account the legislation in the US from the 70s. So Elizabeth, I wanted to bring back to you because it's an interesting dynamic right now in the UK between having had a legislation, the Public Disclosure Act, for like over 20 years now, but at the same time sort of being inspired by some of the progress that has been made with the directive. Could you maybe share with us what the current reform debates are in the UK, and what are sort of the points that we're seeing there?
Yes, I think it is, as I said, incredibly disappointing that the really good steps forward that the directive offers us are not necessarily going to be picked up in the UK. What we found in particular, I think, is that there's a very narrow view of workers in our legislation, job applicants, those who facilitate, family members, all of those groups not currently included. It's very narrow from the trade union perspective, because trade unions are not only not protected at the moment for raising concerns, but a whistleblower, more importantly, a whistleblower who raised their concern with their trade union wouldn't necessarily be automatically protected. We think that needs to change. And the idea that all employers should have, all employers of 50 or more employees should have whistleblowing arrangements, that would be a complete game changer for us in the UK, because we have a very narrow approach to that. Some sectors, health and financial services, civil aviation, those kind of sectors, yes, they have strong rules. Other sectors have absolutely nothing. So there's an awful lot that we in the UK think we could be improving our own legislation for. And the debates, there is some interest in Parliament. We've produced our own bill at Protect to sort of pull together not just things from the directive, but also looking across the world and saying, where are these really good changes that we could see? And there is some movement in Parliament. There are some private members' backbench bills that are coming forward. But so far, we haven't managed to get a strong commitment from the government that they will reform this law. The thing we have to hold them to is the idea that that Brexit will not mean that there's a diminution of workers' rights in the UK. And in fact, there are some positive statements that say, the UK wants to keep pace, wants to carry on being, at the forefront of workers' protections. And so that's what we're going to be holding the government to.
Yeah, maybe the silver lining of Brexit can be to use that as an excuse to say, well, Britain should go even further and have even a further more protection vis-a-vis the continent, whatever one can do to sort of have a convincing argument, compelling. But thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing. We have another question from an attendee that actually I want to bring to Arron, because I think it's very fitting in terms of your expertise and your doctoral thesis, Arron. So the attendee is asking, I'll just read also for the other participants, that of course trade unions sometimes make it impossible or even futile for workers to speak up, and they rightly so provide the US police associations, for example, as in frustrating investigations into police brutality. This is something that surely we don't only see in the US, but has been, for example, documented in other practices, including previous whistleblowing cases in Ireland, for example. So the question then would be, are there any attempts within the trade union movement to measure and challenge problematic attitudes and behaviors within unions, or agree to prioritize members' interests over the public interest? That is a significant issue that needs to be overcome. And if you could recommend if there's any work being done to promote whistleblowing within trade unions themselves, which I think is actually an excellent question, sort of, because obviously one can blow the whistle on trade unions too. So Arron, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess the simple answer is I didn't see any evidence of trade unions, kind of trying to keep record or documenting whistleblowing. I think that probably comes down to the fact that they themselves don't understand what whistleblowing is. So how can they track something they don't understand themselves? So yeah, I don't see any best practice around that. I guess where I did see trade unions having potentially a positive impact within the UK data that I noticed was that where an individual is a trade union member, they would have more support from their colleagues around blowing the whistle. That was from that data sample of 360 cases. So and we did notice, and there is a noticeable difference between those who are in the trade union having support from colleagues and that are also in the trade union, and those that are not in the union. So that if you're not in a union, you're blowing the whistle, support from colleagues is much reduced. And that possibly could be because they've got the trade union dynamic, the collective nature. But again, I don't think I had enough data to make that an explicit finding. That's something that would need further research to kind of understand why that difference exists. And so what was the second part of the question?
Blowing the whistle on trade unions themselves. So sort of within trade unions, kind of, or for practices, or if you've come across any examples of that nature.
I haven't, no. And I don't think the trade unions themselves would recognize it as whistleblowing themselves. I mean, a couple of the unions that I spoke to at the national level, that their response was, oh, this isn't an issue for our members, so we don't have any policy, we don't engage in this area because it's not an issue. Now, the data that I showed at the beginning of my presentation clearly shows that whistleblowing is an issue for trade union members. And not only that, those two unions that I spoke to were based on previous research between Protect and the University of Greenwich inside Story 1, showed that those two unions were in the biggest sectors for whistleblowing. They were in the top two sectors for whistleblowing. So that in itself is worrying as well. So no, I haven't seen any best practice around trade unions supporting, and I haven't seen any evidence of whistleblowing within trade unions or trade unions dealing with whistleblowing within the trade union movement itself.
Martin, I would like to bring this back to you because maybe you can counterbalance this not very optimistic answer from Arron. So maybe you can share with us your thoughts or on these two questions.
Well, only partly. I mean, first of all, trade unions are also employers, and as always, there are problems also in trade union organizations when things are not dealt with properly as they should be. I mean, this is also one of the reasons why we are trying also to educate unions, because we have really, we need to apply good best practices to ourselves as well. Well, I know from my home country, Sweden, there's a lot of scrutiny on trade unions, especially the tabloid press is doing a lot of research about how members' money are spent on alcohol, on expensive travel arrangements, etc. So I know that in one of the larger unions in Sweden, there was a bit of a scandal, or rather large one. Exactly, the president of the federation had to resign, and following this, there was an internal investigation, and indeed they put in place external whistleblowing channel. So I think in many cases it is not a proactive approach, but rather a reaction to some problem that has occurred in the workplace or in the organization. I think this is a bit of a difference to looking at the multinationals today, because coming up to the adoption of the directive, what we learned, of course, was that this is not going to be a very big issue for the multinational companies, because most of them already have stuff in place working with compliance because they see the value of this. And this has to be the case also for trade unions. We need to learn this, and with the directive, we will also, in most cases, I mean, when there are trade unions with more than 50 employees, which I think applies to a lot of trade unions, then we also will be obliged to put in place internal reporting channels. So in the cases where we are not up to par and we are not applying best practice, we really need to get there. And of course, it's important that trade union apply higher standards to ourselves than what we can expect from employers.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, so much. We have a very important question actually as well, which is what the relationship is between the European Directive on Whistleblower Protection and GDPR. And actually, it's something that I've written on, and there's more work taking place because there's an interesting relationship between these two legal regimes. In the past, privacy was seen as European, whistleblowing as American. So after the financial crisis, when the US put in place legislation that exactly, Martin, as you said, multinationals, every company that was publicly traded, registered publicly traded in the US stock exchange had to have whistleblower hotlines, because it was shown, especially in the financial sector, that oftentimes it was precisely because these voices were not taken into account that a lot of the issues arose to that extent. So what happened was that we had a decision at the time from the French authorities on data protection, because it was viewed that some of these hotlines and reporting procedures were not very much in line with protecting the personal data of the individuals involved in the reporting. So basically the people that you're reporting about, et cetera, et cetera. But we've moved past that, I think, and there's actually new now decisions, both again from the German data authorities and the French data authorities, that are looking into how that should be implemented. There's also been decisions from the European Data Protection Supervisory Authority. So there's been more and more guidance. We're happy to we can follow up also in providing the links to these kind of documents that sort of say, the gist of it is that, to put it simply, that whistleblowing, one can blow the whistle about the breach of data privacy rules. So that in itself is interesting, that whistleblowing is used as a tool in order to make sure that privacy protections are being used. And if you think about the Cambridge Analytica example, it's very much along those lines, because it's precisely a whistleblower that brought to public attention the fact that data was being misused, and obviously without the knowledge of and consent of the individuals. But of course, the procedures in place that the employers should put in terms of internal reporting, as well as, of course, the external authorities, should be in compliance with the GDPR. And that is not as complicated as it sounds. I think there's, technically speaking, ways to make these laws are not in conflict with each other. They just sort of require procedures that through the internal reporting that can take place. So I hope I sort of took the liberty to answer this privacy question, since I'm passionate about both topics. And in a very, I'm afraid we only have about less than or so 10 minutes left. And all right, I am not seeing questions from the participants. So I wanna bring back the questions to Nayla in terms of, we spoke a lot on what's taken place already and where it's going forward. I wanted to sort of emphasize, what are the one or two things that you really should, call upon other trade unions, so to say, on focusing, so making sure that at least we have some more common standards throughout the European Union that trade unions should be doing and focusing on the national implementation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Vigjilenca. Well, one thing is very important that Martin mentioned, but we already have it in France, is the working condition, to be able to blow the whistle when we see problems on working conditions. This is something very important. The good thing is that we have this non-regression clause in the directive, so we can keep it here in France, but it's good that it could be everywhere in all the member states. One thing also is important is that trade unions can be active in the whistleblowers procedure. So what we ask for and what we will hope that we'll win this is to reinforce the possibilities of alert reporting by including trade unions as whistleblowers and as facilitators. So this is something very important. And of course, what I said already, the internal channel and how to put them in place, this we at the company level, we would like to have a negotiation with the employer on this thing. And just want to add one thing also about the procedure in France, because we already we just started the transposition work on this. We already last year sent an open letter to the government and another one in November this year also, but the government didn't answer. So we are working now together with some members of the parliament that will propose a law on a parliamentary initiative. So we had just yesterday a meeting, and I think this is the way that we will start transposing the directive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very encouraging to hear such a proactive approach and sort of, and I definitely echo what you said in terms of making sure that other countries do include working conditions and that internal reporting is done. And just for the non-lawyers potentially as participants, the non-regression clause means that the directive provides for a common floor, meaning you cannot go lower than that. But if you had prior standards nationally that were higher than what the directive provides, you get to maintain those, that you do not use this directive as an excuse to sort of go back on protections. That would be very much contrary to the spirit and the idea of the directive trying to protect whistleblowers. Well, I want to personally thank you all for this excellent panel and dynamic answers. And Martin, I will pass on to you for sort of a final closure, maybe a bit more on the resources and Eurocadres work to follow through, but also anything that you want to sort of wrap up for today's webinar. And personally, I thank you once again for an excellent discussion.
Thank you, Vigjilenca, for moderating this panel, and thank you to all the participants in the panel, to Arron, to Elizabeth, to Nayla, to Rick. This has been really interesting. I'm looking forward to continue working together with you. We need to step up the work in the transposition. When COVID hit us, of course, this meant that a lot of work was put aside, and COVID was the only important issue for trade unions to deal with all the occupational health and safety aspects, all the layoffs and restructuring following in the aftermath with the economic crisis following COVID-19. But now we are going to live for a while with this pandemic, and we need to figure out a way to deal with these important issues. I don't see that we will have any delay in the transposition. I know that in the member states, of course, there are delays. They didn't get started as early as necessary. I would like to point to a resource where you can follow the transposition work of the member states. The organization Whistleblowing International Network, which Eurocadres is a proud member of as well. We are from Eurocadres side and from Transparency International EU office side, cooperating together with the Whistleblowing International Network in the setup of the EU Whistleblowing meter. And I have posted in the chat the link to this. It's euwhistleblowingmeter.polymeter.org. And there you can follow the progress of what is going on in the member states. All the EU member states have a country editor which follows the work in the member states and reports to this online tool. I would also recommend you to check the resource page of the whistleblowerprotection.eu platform website, and also that link is in the chat. Now, one of the key issues which have been highlighted many times here today is, of course, to push for a horizontal application. And here I think we should point out also we have the support of the Commission. When the Commission published their original proposal to the directive, they at the same time also published a communication which basically asks the member states to go beyond. And I think this is an information that we should all use. We would not only be better off as trade unions and as whistleblowers if this is put in place in a better way in the member states, but it will also be better for the judicial systems. The courts will have an easier job to deal with the aftermath of reporting and so on. So for everyone's sake, we should really push for a horizontal application. And if we can't succeed there, well, we need to ensure to include working conditions, anti-discrimination, and occupational health and safety. So later this afternoon, as Elizabeth Gardiner from Protect presented the toolkit, it will be available on our website. And I think you saw also in the chat that we have quite a few translations coming to it. We will German, Hungarian, Polish, Italian, French, and Spanish will be coming online during next week. But keep an eye out this afternoon and you'll be able to download your English version of the toolkit, and we'll of course share it on social media. If you missed the beginning of this webinar, we will ensure to post it in our social media and on our Eurocadres.eu website as well, so you can get it from the very beginning. And with those few words, I would like to thank you all participants and all participants of the panel for your active participation today. And now let's roll up our sleeves and continue the important transposition work in the member states. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.